I never thought I would be the kind of woman who lets temptation creep into her life. I never imagined myself sitting here, picking apart the choices that led me here. I was always so sure of who I was. A devoted wife. A mother. A woman who believed in loyalty, in love that stands the test of time. But looking back, I see how easy it was. How it didn't happen all at once, but little by little, until I had already lost control. Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains mature themes. It deals with the challenges of temptation, betrayal, and the weight of choices that can never be undone. If these topics make you uncomfortable, you might want to stop watching now. But if you stay, I promise you, this story is one you won't forget. Because I haven't. My name is Katie Mullen. I am 32 years old. If you met me a year ago, you would have seen a woman who had it all together. I married my best friend, Jameson Mullen. We built a life that, from the outside, looked perfect. A solid marriage. A beautiful home. A brand new baby, our first child. But things aren't always as simple as they seem. Jameson's job keeps him away for weeks at a time. I knew this when I married him, and I accepted it. But after the birth of our baby, being alone in that house was harder than I expected. The exhaustion, the late nights, the endless crying, it wore me down in ways I never saw coming. So when my sister, Kara, invited me to stay with her while Jameson was away, I agreed. It made sense. She had space. I wouldn't be alone with a newborn. And for a while, it was exactly what I needed. Kara's home was warm. Familiar. Her 2 kids running through the house, the smell of dinner cooking, the sound of laughter, it was comforting. A break from the loneliness I hadn't even admitted I was feeling. And then, there was Johan. Johan Weitz. Her son. My nephew. He had just turned 20. I remember him as a kid, awkward, lanky, always glued to his video games. But somewhere between last summer and now, he had changed. I noticed it the first time I saw him after moving in. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed a water bottle, said a quick, "Hey," before heading back upstairs. But I stood there, frozen. Because the boy I had known was gone. Johan wasn't a kid anymore. He was taller, stronger. His voice was deeper. His confidence had shifted, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain. And in that moment, something I can't explain happened to me. I told myself it was nothing. That I was just noticing a change, the way any relative would. But then I started noticing more. How he walked around the house in nothing but sweatpants, shirtless after a workout, his skin damp from the heat. How his cologne lingered in the hallway. How his voice carried from upstairs, casual, easy, but different now. And worst of all, how he looked at me. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't obvious. But it was there. A flicker of something I didn't want to name. At first, I ignored it. Brushed it off. I was tired. Emotional. It was nothing. But I was lying to myself. And soon, pretending wasn't enough. Johan was just a kid, my nephew, after all. I had watched him grow up. But I wasn't looking at him the same way anymore. It wasn't intentional. I wasn't thinking about it, at least not at first. But then I started noticing him. It would happen in small moments, when he'd walk through the living room after a shower, his hair still damp, wearing nothing but a towel slung low on his hips. Or when he came home from the gym, sweat clinging to his skin, his breathing still heavy from his workout. I'd catch myself staring. A second too long. Just noticing. That's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. Then, I started noticing something else. He was always there. At first, it felt like coincidence. I'd be nursing in the quiet of the living room, rocking my baby to sleep, and suddenly, Johan would walk in. Maybe to grab a drink from the kitchen. Maybe to throw himself onto the couch, pretending to be watching TV. But then, it kept happening. Every time I was pumping milk, nursing, adjusting my robe, he would appear. At first, I felt self-conscious. I would turn away, shift positions, cover myself. But then, I started to notice something. He wasn't just walking in. He was watching. Not obviously. Never directly. But I could feel it. The way his eyes flickered when he thought I wouldn't notice. The way his breath would catch just slightly before he looked away. And I should have felt disgusted. I should have stopped it right there. But I didn't. Instead, a part of me felt flattered. I had given birth just 2 months ago. My body had changed. My stomach wasn't as tight, my curves weren't the same. I spent my days exhausted, my nights broken by the sound of my baby crying. Jameson was gone. And suddenly, I had this young, strong, beautiful man looking at me in a way that made me feel like I still mattered. I hated myself for thinking it. But that didn't stop the way my body reacted. And then, I started testing it. It started small. I stopped covering up so quickly. If my robe slipped a little, I wouldn't rush to fix it. If my shirt rode up while nursing, I wouldn't pull it down right away. And when I saw the way his breath hitched, his hands fidgeted, the way he shifted uncomfortably before leaving the room, something in me woke up. It was a thrill I didn't want to name. I started dressing differently. Not obviously. Nothing anyone would notice. But I knew. Looser tops. Lower necklines. Shorts instead of pajama pants when I was in the house. It was subtle. Barely anything. But it was enough. And he noticed. I told myself I would never act on it. That this was nothing more than a game in my head. But the body doesn't lie. And soon, neither did my actions. Johan started talking to me more. Before, we had never been close. He was a teenager. I was the married aunt with a newborn. But now, he would linger. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I would sit in the living room, rocking my baby back to sleep, and he'd come down. Couldn't sleep, he'd ask, his voice deep, tired, warm. And I would smile, shaking my head. No. You? Nah. Too much on my mind. He never said what. And I never asked. But I felt it. The unspoken tension. The quiet moments that lasted just a little too long. The way he sat too close. The way his eyes dropped, just for a second, to places they shouldn't. I should have told him to stop. I should have told myself to stop. But I didn't. Because it was nothing. Until it wasn't. One night, I was nursing in the living room. The baby had fallen asleep, my shirt still unbuttoned, my body still exposed. Johan walked in. I expected him to turn around, to leave. He didn't. His eyes found me, just for a moment. And I saw something in them that I couldn't ignore. Heat. Hunger. Something a boy should never feel for a woman like me. And worse. I didn't look away. I should have. But I didn't. It could have stopped there. It should have stopped there. But some things have a way of pulling you in, even when every part of you is screaming to run. It was a Sunday afternoon. The kind that felt like nothing could happen. The house was quiet. My sister had taken the kids out for a few hours, giving me a rare moment of peace. I was sitting on the couch, nursing my baby, my body tired but relaxed for the first time in days. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the room, making everything feel safe. Normal. And then the door opened. Johan walked in. His shirt was damp, clinging to his chest. His hair was messy, sweat sticking to his forehead. He had just come back from the gym, his breathing still heavy, his body still warm. He saw me. And I saw him. And for the first time, I didn't look away. I should have. But I didn't. Instead, I let the moment stretch. I let him be the one to break eye contact, to shift uncomfortably as if he had walked into something he shouldn't have. He cleared his throat, looking toward the kitchen, pretending he wasn't flustered. "Hey," he mumbled. "Hey," I said back, my voice softer than I meant for it to be. I waited for him to leave. But he didn't. Instead, he walked past me, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off his skin. And when he grabbed a water bottle from the fridge, I watched. I let my eyes roam, just for a second. Strong arms. Broad shoulders. The way his muscles moved as he tilted his head back, drinking. I felt something then. A pull. A thrill. I should have looked away. But instead, I waited. And then, I started testing him. It was subtle. So small that it would have been easy to pretend it wasn't happening. The way I sat when he entered the room. The way my shirt slipped off my shoulder and I didn't fix it right away. The way I laughed at his jokes a little longer than I should have. I let my fingers brush against his when handing him something. And he didn't pull away. At first, it was just a game in my head. Would he notice? Would his breath catch when I leaned too close? Would his eyes flicker downward when I stretched, letting my shirt rise just a little? I didn't tell myself why I was doing it. I didn't want to know. But then, it stopped being a game. One night, the baby had just fallen asleep, and I was pumping in the dim glow of the living room lamp. It was quiet. Just me and the rhythmic hum of the machine. And then, I felt it. A presence. I looked up. Johan was standing in the doorway. He wasn't moving. He wasn't leaving. He was watching. I should have covered myself. I should have said something. But I didn't. Instead, I let it happen. I let his eyes stay on me. I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and charged. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned, slowly, and walked away. But I knew then. I knew. Whatever this was, it wasn't just in my head anymore. So, I made a decision. The next day, I tested it again. Not subtly this time. Not by accident. I sat in the living room, the baby napping upstairs, my shirt loose. My blouse unbuttoned, just enough. And I waited. I waited for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. For the front door to open. And when he walked in, his eyes found me immediately. He froze. He wasn't pretending anymore. And I knew, in that moment, there was no turning back. Not now. Not ever. He stood there. Frozen. The front door had barely clicked shut behind him. His backpack was still slung over one shoulder. His keys dangled from his fingers. But he wasn't moving. Because his eyes were on me. On my body. On the way my blouse had slipped off one shoulder, my bare skin catching the glow of the afternoon light. I should have covered myself. I should have ended it right there. But instead, I shifted slightly, the movement just enough to make the fabric of my shirt slide open a little more. And that was it. That was the moment. Because suddenly, he wasn't just looking. He was breathing differently. His fingers clenched around his keys. His mouth parted slightly, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. And I waited. I let the silence stretch between us, knowing full well that whatever happened next would change everything. I gave him an excuse. A reason to stay. And he took it. I tilted my head slightly, my voice soft, careful. "Could you help me with something?" His eyes flickered to mine, his chest rising and falling a little too fast. He didn't answer. But he didn't leave, either. I exhaled, pressing a hand to my chest. "I think my milk duct is clogged." Silence. A sharp breath from him. Then. "The baby doesn't latch on hard enough, and it's starting to hurt. It was a lie. A beautiful, terrible lie. And the moment I said it, I knew exactly what I was doing. Because I could have walked upstairs, grabbed a warm compress, massaged it away myself. But I didn't. I asked him. I watched his throat bob as he swallowed hard. Ah. My mom will be home in an hour, he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. It was the last defense. The final chance to stop this before it started. I could have laughed, waved it off, said I was joking. I could have told him to go upstairs, take a shower, forget this ever happened. But I didn't. Instead, I reached out, just slightly, just enough to close the distance between us. Our secret, I whispered. And then, everything unraveled. He sat down next to me. And I let him. His hands were on his knees. His whole body was tense, his eyes darting everywhere but at me. But he wasn't leaving. I reached for his hand, my fingers barely grazing his. It's okay, I whispered. His breath hitched. A moment passed, too long, too charged. Then, he leaned in. I could feel his warmth, his hesitation, the question hanging between us. And before I could stop myself, I let it happen. I sucked in a sharp breath. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped it. But instead, I pressed a hand against the back of his head. I pulled him closer. And that was it. That was the moment we crossed the line. For 20 minutes, I lost myself. 20 minutes. That's how long I let him stay there. And the worst part? It felt good. Too good. Because for the first time in months, I wasn't just someone's mother. I wasn't just a wife waiting for her husband to come home. I was something else. Wanted. Desired. Alive. And that was what scared me the most. It wasn't planned. That's what I told myself. But I know now, that was a lie. The baby's cry snapped me back to reality. It was sharp. Piercing. A sound that pulled me back into my body, into my role, into the life I had just betrayed. Johann pulled away so fast, it was like he had been burned. His lips were still slightly parted, his breath uneven, his hands shaking at his sides. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. Instead, I fumbled with my shirt, buttoning it with trembling fingers, my hands moving too fast, like I could somehow erase what had just happened if I fixed my clothes quickly enough. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the baby crying upstairs. A reminder. A warning. A lifeline I had been too blind to see before. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to be steady. This never happened, I whispered. Johann's jaw tightened. He nodded. But his eyes said otherwise. And I hated the part of me that wanted to see something in them. Some kind of regret. Some kind of guilt. But there was something else, too. Something that made my stomach flip, even as shame crawled up my throat. He wasn't just regretting it. He was wanting it. And so was I. I thought if I avoided him, it would go away. That I could pretend it never happened. But it's hard to ignore something when it's always there, right in front of you. For the next few days, I did everything I could not to be alone with him. I kept myself busy, cooking, cleaning, tending to the baby. I went to bed earlier. Left the room whenever he walked in. But it didn't matter. Because the tension followed me everywhere. It was in the way I felt his presence before I even saw him. In the way he hesitated before speaking to me, as if we were walking a tightrope and neither of us knew how to get off. And worst of all, it was in the way our eyes met across the room. I wanted to be disgusted with myself. I wanted to feel nothing but guilt. But the human mind has a way of rewriting its own story, doesn't it? I started rationalizing it. Telling myself it wasn't what it seemed. It wasn't real. It was hormones. Exhaustion. A lapse in judgment from being alone for too long. I wasn't myself that day. It wasn't about him. It was about needing comfort. I love my husband. This means nothing. But no matter how many times I whispered these things to myself at night, they never felt true. Because the problem wasn't what had happened. The problem was that I kept reliving it. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the heat of his breath on my skin. Every time I was alone in a room, I remembered the weight of his hands. And every time I looked at him, I wanted more. The worst part wasn't that it happened. The worst part was realizing I didn't regret it as much as I should have. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat. A dream, not a nightmare. A memory. The way his lips had felt on me. The way my body had reacted before my mind had the chance to stop it. I sat up in bed, pressing my palms to my face, breathing heavily. And then I heard it. A sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Slow. Hesitant. I knew it was him. And I should have stayed in bed. I should have let him pass by, let him walk back to his room, let the silence stretch between us so this could end. But I didn't. Instead, I stood. I walked toward the door. And I waited. Because I knew. If I opened it. If I stepped into that hallway. This would never be over. I told myself it was a one-time mistake. But mistakes have a way of repeating themselves when they go unpunished. Infidelity doesn't always start with a kiss. Sometimes, it starts with a glance. A lingering touch. A thought you shouldn't have entertained. And before you even realize what's happening, it's already too late. People think betrayal happens in an instant. That it's loud. Violent. That it comes crashing down like thunder, sudden and unavoidable. But the truth is, it's quiet. It sneaks up on you in the small moments. The way your heart skips when someone looks at you differently. The way a casual touch lingers a second longer than it should. The way you justify things in your mind, small things, harmless things, until you've told yourself so many lies that you don't even recognize them anymore. That's how it happens. And that's exactly how it happened to me. I thought it was over. But the worst part about crossing a line is realizing how easy it is to do it again. I stayed away from him for the next few days. I tried to pretend that nothing had happened. That I hadn't let him touch me. That I hadn't let myself enjoy it. But deep down, I knew. I knew it wasn't over. Because the guilt didn't keep me awake at night. The want did. The memory of it. The feeling of being seen. Of being desired. And that terrified me more than anything. Because I should have felt shame. I should have been praying for the moment to fade from my mind. But instead, I was waiting for it to happen again. I wanted to tell myself it wouldn't. That I had learned my lesson. But I didn't even believe that anymore. Because when I walked into the kitchen and saw him there. When his eyes met mine across the room. When I felt the heat of his stare, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. I knew. He was waiting, too. We weren't done. Not yet. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted it to end. Will I confess to my husband? Will I let this happen again? I wish I had the answer. But here's the truth. Some mistakes can't be undone. Some choices change you in ways you can't take back. And even if I never act on it again, even if nothing ever happens between us again, I already know it's too late. Because I crossed that line the moment I let myself wonder. The moment I let myself want. And now, no matter what happens next, I have to live with it. Some lines should never be crossed. Because once you do, there's no undoing it. If this story made you think, if it made you question, reflect, or feel something you weren't expecting, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me your thoughts. Would you have stopped before it went too far? Or do you think once temptation sets in, there's no stopping it? And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We share more stories like this, raw, real, and unfiltered. Stories that challenge the way we think about love, trust, and betrayal. And if you think someone needs to hear this, share it. Because sometimes, the hardest lessons come from the stories we least expect. Thank you for watching. Until next time, be careful with the lines you cross.